All right, so again, thank everyone for coming. As I talked to Dr. Drake, we have been reviewing some of his clips, so we know all about him, know his favorite color, and we know that he loves being here in Ohio. So as I read his bio, Dr. Michael V. Drake is the 15th president of The Ohio State University. His vision for the university's future focuses on access, affordability, and excellence, with an emphasis on groundbreaking research and modern and effective teaching. Other focus areas include deepening the university's community engagement and advancing inclusive excellence and diversity. He has been a leader in higher education for nearly 4 decades, serving as Chancellor for the University of California, Irvine for 9 years prior to his arrival at The Ohio State University. During his tenure, Dr. Drake made significant progress that resulted in Irvine being recognized as a national leader in increasing minority enrollment and sustainability. In 2014, UC Irvine ranked #1 nationally on Sierra Magazine's list of the 10 coolest schools for improving energy efficiency and sustainability. Dr. Drake is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has been named Vice Chair of the Association of American Universities for 2016 and 17 and will serve as Committee Chair in 2017 and 18. He currently serves as the AAU Member Committee and is completing a 3-year term on the Board of Directors. He also serves in leadership roles for the University Innovation Alliance and American Talent Initiatives, National Collegiate Association, and Big Ten, and as chair of the Council of Presidents of Associations for Public and Land Grant University. Can you help me welcome The Ohio State President, Michael?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the nice introduction. OH? Hi. There we go. I wanted to make sure I had the right crowd. I will talk for a few minutes, and then I'd love to hear questions and hear things from you that you'd like for us to be able to discuss. So I'll try to say a few things at the beginning and then leave enough time to talk at the end. Happy to be here and happy to talk to you about leadership and things that are important to us in leadership. I'm a medical doctor by training, and I began my career thinking that I was going to be a medical doctor like medical doctors, like I'd have an office and a shingle and patients and do that. I began instead with a slight difference. I learned during medical school about research and academics and things I hadn't known so much about, and so in fact had a career as an academic physician, which meant that I had an office and I had practice, and I was a surgeon for many years. I'm an ophthalmologist. I did eye surgery for many years, but it was in an academic medical center, so I was also a professor, so I did research and teaching, and for a variety of circumstances I began my career with administrative responsibilities. So I started and my first day I had a staff and an organization to run and employees and a budget, and it was an unusual thing. So I had all these things sort of mixed together, and I found myself more organizationally focused than I had realized was possible. And I would say that because at the beginning I didn't realize that I didn't know what the organization did or how the organization worked, but I began with these responsibilities, and so I had to learn that a bit. And then I found myself working with people a lot on the overall governance of the university, the overall governance of the hospitals, much more than I had expected to. So I just found that I had these larger administrative responsibilities, and so I took a course. I went, one thing led to another, and I went away for 3 months and took a course at a program in Boston, a thing called the Advanced Management Program, AMP, and there people who were in a variety of organizations were learning about finance, business, etc., but also leadership. There was a segment of the course that was focused on leadership, and I paid particular attention to that. I was actually in a job-changing phase then, and the section on leadership was very important. Very, very interesting to me as I was in this job-changing phase. So I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about some of the things that came from that, and then the chance I had to apply some of those principles, and then use that as the basis of what we were talking about. So, so this program was about 10 weeks, and it was very intense. You lived there. It was 6.5 days a week, so it was all Monday through Friday morning till about 10 o'clock at night, and then Saturday morning until about noon, and then Sunday evening, and then starting again. And so that was great. You lived in a small cohort. A third of the people were from the U.S., 2/3 were from other countries. And the industries represented were quite broad. They were mining or airlines or the travel industry. There were a few people who were running hospitals, 1 or 2 people who were in the academic world, but not many. Most of this was business, and most of the discussion, most of the curriculum focused on borrowing huge amounts of money and making your quarterly reports and all kinds of business-focused things. But toward the end, there were a couple of days on leadership, and actually John Cotter was the leadership professor at the time who led the large part of that discussion. And there were several things that I heard in the course that I wanted to share. So the first is that the description that we used that meant a lot to me or stuck with me is that you can manage a supply line, but you have to lead in a battle. And the concept of that was that a supply line, where you have a lot of people working together doing certain things, you can sketch out what you want it to be. I want 20 trucks to show up here at 8 o'clock in the morning and drive down this road carrying mattresses and soup or whatever the things that trucks carry. So you could sort of set those things up. Who's going to drive which truck? Where are you going to go? What order you're in, etc. We had commencement this last Sunday, and on Sunday I knew where I was supposed to line up, where I was supposed to sit, who was going to speak first, and that was all scripted out. And so you can sort of manage things like that. In the military circumstance I'm using as an example, that works great until the battle starts. And when the battle starts and you're on the battlefield, then all those things don't work. Then you're getting a huge amount of new information, like new information every second. And you're having to make judgments based on that new information. And the new information, the things that are happening actually change the circumstances second by second going along. And the information you're getting is often not clear, it's not prioritized, it's routinely incorrect, and you're trying to filter all of this information and to make decisions. And so in a battle, in something like that, you have to take what you know, what you want to do, and you have to absorb and process new information without there being clear direction. There's no one there to tell you what to do or who to follow. And I always thought that was an interesting way to describe management, really critically important, and leadership. Another example I'll give of management and leadership is a football example. I do work at the Ohio State University. The Ohio State University, and so there's a coach who's passed away. And Bill Walsh, who developed a thing called the West Coast Offense. I'm just curious, how many people have heard of Bill Walsh, just as a name? How many people have an idea of West Coast Offense? So a few. And Bill Walsh, 40 years or so ago, using statistics and analysis and things like that, understood that a short forward pass was as safe as a run. And so he began using short forward passes as a way to control the ball and move forward, interspersed with runs and longer forward passes. Prior to that, not to be too simple, prior to that it was runs for short yardage and forward passes for longer yardage, but Walsh found a way to kind of use precision short forward passes, very quick, to make things happen. And he did this thing that was so unusual at the time, groundbreaking, is that he would script out before the game the first 25 plays of the game. So here's what we're going to do, first time, second time, third time, and have them all written down. That was crazy, because the games had always been run like battles, where every decision is made kind of in the moment. What are we going to do next? Okay. So he would script them out and then change those if the circumstances changed. I mean, different things could make him change. He could substitute a certain play in a certain time. But basically, he had a script of what was going to be done, and the team all knew that when they went out there. Once the ball was hiked, then the quarterback's job, this was Joe Montana in those days, the quarterback's job was to be the leader. So the management is what we're going to do, how we're going to line up, what our play is. That was all managed. And then the quarterback would jump back, pick up information in those first few seconds, and then make a decision. And that was the leadership. And it worked very, very well. And in fact, it's the way that everyone does these things today. It's very, very critical. In fact, one of the things that's happened over the last several years is quarterbacks have gotten taller and taller. And part of that reason is so they can scan the field easily, get that new information, make those decisions very, very quickly, because it's a critical part of managing the way things, or making leadership decisions as things are moving forward. So the ability to be able to put yourself in a position where you can receive incomplete, incorrect, foggy, non-prioritized information and make good decisions, that's leadership in many ways. And I've learned a couple things I've had a couple positions of leadership, and I've really learned something that's been fascinating going forward. And so I mentioned I was a medical doctor, and I had different jobs in dean's offices and things like that. And then my administrative responsibilities got a bit larger. And after taking this course in Boston, when I went back to my prior employee, my job switched, and I went from being a vice president for health affairs, kind of overseeing the healthcare system, to being a chancellor of a campus. So now I moved out of the strictly healthcare arena into the broad arena of higher education. But I also was the single person. I wasn't a vice anything. I was the whatever. And I noticed something fascinating. I had just had this little course in leadership. And I noticed something really fascinating there. And that was that just as I had been told would be the case, I was getting information that was coming from all different directions. And it was foggy, it was not prioritized, and all those things were true, and you had to make decisions. And something else that was fascinating that I noted, and it took a while to process it, is that people would tell me things that weren't true. And in fact, they would tell me things that weren't true routinely, and or mostly. Now, sometimes they were untrue, like they were things that were not true. More often, they were true mostly, but they were shaded in order to get a certain reaction. Part of it was that they didn't want to tell me things that they thought I didn't want to hear. So one of the things that happens in positions of leadership is people do what they can to tell you things that they think that you want to hear, because they believe that if they do that, that will make you happy, and that will be good for them. And so not in a bad way or a pernicious way or anything else, but it's awkward. You don't want to make the boss angry or whatever. You want to come in and give good news, so there's a high five at the end of the conversation, but that leads all of us to kind of shade things. When I talk to politicians, we hear this thing, politically correct speech. We hear described a lot. I used air quotes around politically correct. So it means different things when different people say it. Real political correctness is when any of us talk to politicians or testify before the legislature. We're thinking really, really carefully about how we're saying it. And when you read what politicians say in the newspaper or anything else, most of them, they're really, really careful the words they use. Really thoughtful about the words that they use moving forward. And so those things happen. So as a leader, then what you have is foggy, incomplete, rapid, non-prioritized information, and then people giving you information that may not be exactly candid, or exactly true to the point, exactly right on. And that's a fascinating thing. And so you have to stir all that together and try and pull from that the things you can use to make decisions. So the things that so another module in our course was, how do you then guide yourself in those circumstances? What do you use? Since the information is not, you can't just say, well, I have 2 and 2 and 2, that means I have 6. You can't add things up and get to a conclusion really simply. You have to process it. And one of the things that they mentioned to me that has been most valuable to me is to use values. And so we spoke about the concept of values-based decision-making. And values would really mean being clear about what's important to you, what matters to you, and then why. And having a set of values that you understand and that you use and that you apply, particularly when things are confusing or rapid, or you're not quite sure what's true or how much of it's true, or it's shaded or tilted, using those values helps you to get to a place where you can make a decision that you can at least be happy with. when I got to my last job, I was being interviewed one morning, and I had just heard this, and they said, well, I said, values-based decision making, that sounds like a good thing. What are your values? And I hadn't thought of them. So I said, excuse me a second, you're breaking up. And but I thought that I should write some down. So I wrote a series down, and I wrote down 7, because 7 seemed like a good number. 3 wouldn't be enough, and 15 you couldn't remember. So 7 seemed like a good number. So I wrote down 7, and I can actually tell you what they were. I wrote down respect. I wrote down intellectual curiosity. I wrote down integrity or truth-telling. I think that's really, really important. I wrote down passion or commitment, the real value of doing your best. I wrote down empathy. I spent a lot of time as a medical doctor. I included as a value appreciation for others, and I always had to explain that to people by saying it would be like tolerance. But tolerance is hierarchical. You tolerate sitting on a pebble or something, whatever analogy you use. So that's something but appreciation for the different circumstances or points of view or life experiences of people who you're interacting with, particularly those who you disagree with, I think is really important. And finally, fun. And I said fun because I actually meant it. I was moving to a university, and I thought, gosh, what should this experience be? And I thought, well, it really ought to be a fun and enjoyable experience. And as I've thought about these values over the years, fun continues to come back as a really important one, because it ought to feel good. If you're living your life according to values that make sense and that really work, then it ought to feel good. And in fact, if it doesn't, there's something out of whack. So that's really kind of maybe the metric, is that you are enjoying your life and your life is working the way that it should. When you get to a decision based on values, it ought to feel like the right decision, and that you should feel some comfort there. So the fun part is more than just whimsy. It really is that this ought to all work together and be something that makes sense. And then I had a chance on the campus to try the values. And I had thought of them in the context of Palestinian-Israeli conflicts among students and community members on the campus. I say among students and community members. The real conflicting groups were the Muslim students and the Jewish community living outside the campus. So 50, 60, 70-year-old members of the Jewish community, and then very politically active students on campus. The students on campus, the Muslim and Jewish students, tended to have differences of opinion but get along reasonably well. The off-campus groups and the campus students were the real antagonists for each other. Each very engaged in heated discussions. So that was a difficult group. Those were difficult groups to manage, and manage is an overstatement. The interactions between those groups were quite challenging, and using the values in the discussions that I had with them over the years was an extraordinarily helpful way to kind of navigate through. And I also found, though, that we had other issues that came on campus that were issues among our faculty or our medical school or other things that were the normal things that happen on campus. And the values really were helpful in those circumstances as well. And so I got used to the concept of values-based decision-making and found that it was really, really helpful. There have been difficult decisions here. And when I was faced with difficult decisions, I would ask myself, what matters? What do I care about? Why? Think about the values that I'd lined up and say, if I were being a person who was living according to these values, what would I do? And it's always been really clear. It actually got to a clear place, and that's the way to be. It doesn't always necessarily work. Sometimes you're not given a choice between really good and better. You're given a choice between bad and worse. And so you don't end up at a wonderful place at the end. But if you followed your values in getting there, then you can have the comfort that you've arrived there with good reason and be settled with that. The most difficult circumstances that I had to deal with. I don't know how many of you have been. I mentioned Palestinian and Israeli issues. I've had the chance to be in Israel on a couple of occasions, and there's a fascinating place there. There's a cemetery. Who's been to Jerusalem? Just curious. Anybody has? Well, fascinating place to go. And there's a temple on the mountain. You've seen pictures of this, a gold-domed temple, the holiest place in the Muslim religion, in Islam. And then, and it's on a hill. And then there's a kind of a, you can go down the hill, then there's another hill up in back of it, and that hill has a very, very old cemetery. Cemetery, it's thousands of years old. And so you can actually stand at the top of this hill and look over to the temple on the mountain, but it might be half a mile or so away, and there's this kind of valley in between. And so as our guide was telling us the first time I was there, this is the valley of the shadow of death. It's a valley where the cemetery has always been there since biblical times. And so if you walk along in the night, you're kind of in the valley of the shadow of death in this place. And I thought about that physical place and thought about difficult times that we were having and how trying to maintain a values-driven decision and values-driven life decision policy has allowed us to kind of move down that valley and then routinely come out at the other end into the light. And even though you didn't know that was going to happen, even though you weren't sure at all that was going to happen, eventually that has tended to happen. So I feel good about that and sharing it with you. David Brooks, New York Times columns. How many people here know who David Brooks is? Just raise a hand. So interesting columnist, and he's spoken here on campus recently. He did a TED Talk, and he did a TED Talk in 2015 in spring, and he spoke about eulogy versus resume virtues. And so resume virtues are the points that you try to check off on your resume so that you get the job that you want, or your salary is high, or you can have a big house, or whatever those things are. These are things you want on in your resume virtues, the resume virtues side of your personality. There's also the eulogy virtues side, and those are things that people would say about you at the end. And that really is more, and that's not how much you accumulated or the things written in italics after your name, but the kind of person you were, how people felt about you, how you interacted with them. And we would always say that the most important things are the eulogy virtues, who you were as a person, who cared about you, and the difference that you made. But we probably spend 80% of our time working on building the resume virtues. And what David Brooks said in his talk, and many others have said this as well, is that a good balance between those leads to kind of a purpose-driven life that is a great one. I had this great honor, and that was to speak on behalf or at the service of John Glenn a few months ago. And John Glenn was revered by those who didn't know him, and revered more by those who did, but revered in both circumstances. And he was revered by those who didn't know him for his resume virtues, because he had as impressive a resume as a person could achieve. If there were a room of this number of people, and they all had the most impressive resume you could imagine, and John Glenn were one of them, you wouldn't say you shouldn't be here. I mean, he could be in a room with anyone saying, what have you done in your life? And it would be, well, here, I did these things. And everyone would say, whoa, that's pretty amazing. Yeah, but for the people who knew him, he also was at the top of the list for the eulogy virtues, as humble and thoughtful and easy and steadfast as anyone that you knew. And a person who can do both of those things together is someone who's revered and loved, and that's a great height for us to look to as we try to organize ourselves and look at and manage ourselves as we move forward. So, sort of winding up, and I did promise time for questions. So winding up, managing is kind of organizing those things you can organize. Leadership is taking incomplete information coming from a variety of directions that may be untrue and may be foggy, and trying to use that to make the right decisions. And because you can't look at milestones or markers or a mapping going forward, if you're really the one in front, you have to have something that you carry with you that lets you make those decisions based on something that's a little bit higher. And having a values-driven paradigm that you use to apply your decisions to, or that you grade your decisions against, helps you make values-based decisions. And I think that helps you to move forward in a good direction. If done correctly and appropriately, you should generally be, and if you're doing good things, let me say we're all doing good things, so you should be in a good place, and it should feel great. And if you find yourself in a bad place, it's often because you haven't applied your own values or haven't followed those guideposts that you know are the right things to do. So that's my view, and I'm happy to have a chance to share that with you. I appreciate your attention. I look forward to any questions that you might have. Thank you very much. I'd like them to be confusing, unclear, not necessarily true, not prioritized. Okay, great. Tell me, and I'd love to hear, since I don't know, I might not remember exactly who you are and what your role is with us today.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Drake. I'm Ruth McNeil, and I am Community Relations Director for the Franklin County Auditor.
Great.
Thank you, Auditor Clarence Mayville. Thank you for being here.
I can actually walk out here.
Yeah.
A little trepidation, but you feel okay. Okay, great.
I was, first of all, I want to say two things. Ohio State University's onboarding freshman students is bar none. I had a freshman enter last year. I assumed that it would just be crazy, and while there was a lot to do, the organizational structure and the leadership is phenomenal, so thank you.
Thank you.
And she is in the engineering division, which made it even more difficult. I thought was going to be more difficult for her to onboard. It was phenomenal.
Great.
So thank you for that. But the second piece of
Any other questions? Oh, no.
the second is you talked about management, and then you talked about leadership styles, and I love the way you framed that. So I'd like you to kind of share how that operated for you on Monday, November 28th, because I got a phone call at about 10 o'clock that morning from my daughter who said, I'm on lockdown in the building,
yes.
And there's an armed shooter, and she was in one of the new buildings right next door to the parking garage.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how, you know, that organizational piece met with the leadership piece?
Yes. So straightforward. So the management part of it. So first, thanks for the nice comments about move-in, which we'll have in a couple of weeks or 10 days or so. And that's management. Right? Everybody goes to a place. There's the leadership decisions. Somebody drops a quart of milk, but it's management, and so it's really important. And if we hadn't managed those things well, we would have chaos. We've all moved, and we have the opportunity to have 6,000 people moving in a day, and at a life-disrupting time too. The image I have of this is that I participate in it. A van drives up. It's packed to the gills. Mom gets out. Dad gets out. The student gets out. And then a bunch of stuff comes out, and then finally you pull out a teenage sibling, you know, who's grumpy and everything else, who's the younger brother or sister who had to come along and doesn't want to be there. So it's a big deal, and so that's management, and that's why management is really critically important. So when we had this very unfortunate incident last November. So management parts, we've gone through tabletop exercises of what to do in such a circumstance, and we had revamped our communication system purposely and with intention, because we had a couple of things happen where the communication system wasn't adequate, wasn't quick enough, gave too much information, and so we had worked to make sure that we had certain things that we would use only at certain times and that would drive certain behaviors. And this was one of them. And so that all happened right then, and we had, as you know, recently staffed up our police department, and so we had an extra officer or two on duty, and that helped to have somebody right there at the scene who then had been trained appropriately with what to do. And so those things were all true. The leadership part, I'll close the door. I know I'm being filmed, so I'll whisper maybe that way nobody will know. But as this was all happening, I began to get information. I was getting a call about how many victims there were, what had happened, how many shooters there were, where the shooters were. And what I needed to do was to try to filter that through what sounded true, because overwhelmingly it wasn't true. There was one shooter. The one shooter was a police officer. But that was, we heard four. We heard they're in the parking lot. People who were hiding in the parking lot were confused with people who were shooters. And imagine if you were a student of color, and you, when this all happened, and you went then to hide because you're appropriately, we teach we teach them to run, hide, fight is the thing that they're supposed to do. So get away if you can. If you can't get away, make yourself obscure, and if you can't do that, then be as aggressive as you can to try to neutralize the situation. But the first thing is to get away if you can. So students had gone to put themselves places where they're safe. And the airwaves say that there are shooters there, and you're a student hiding, and then plainclothes people come up. So it's a very, very crazy situation that way. So what my job then was to try to be able to process that information as we were giving information back to people about what they should do. And so that's when we had to kind of stir those things together. I would say I talked to extraordinarily senior, responsible people and got information that was absolutely incorrect. And I knew it, actually. I said, that doesn't sound right. But with great authority, I got information from extraordinarily senior people that was, in fact, absolutely incorrect. And but at least I knew that was going to happen. And we didn't change things in a way that it didn't work. There, again, like so many circumstances and leadership circumstances, the better your management is, the narrower the window in which you're having to make decisions, the less uncertainty you have, and that makes it easy. So when things are managed really, really well, then you don't need so much leadership, and that's always good. Yes, how are you?
Good. I'm Terry Benninger. I'm the CIO of the Franklin County Data Center, so the centralized technology organization. I have a question about as a leader, whether it's the mission of the university, whether it's the values that you're defining, with the federated colleges, with the diverse mission that they have, and
yes,
with the amazing leadership that's in place in those organizations, how do you foster shared mutual objectives across whatever that domain is?
Great.
How do you bring other leaders in alignment with your vision?
So everybody, I think, heard the question. It was in a place where we have lots of leaders and a shared but varied mission. How do we organize that group toward the same direction? The biggest challenge, that's the biggest challenge that we have, actually, is alignment of all of that into a direction so that we derive the benefit from each other's efforts maximally. So a couple of things help with that. One is to be clear on the ultimate client and to be able to focus things on what are we doing this for, why are we doing it, and the ultimate client is really all of you, it's all of us, it's our community, our society. So we can always put things into the context of what is this doing to help us in our mission to lift the quality of life in our society broadly. I have a picture on my wall that I've had for 15 years. It's a picture of a farm worker in a field with a baseball cap who can't see the photographer. So he's hoeing or something, and I had that up there years ago. It was given to me by a colleague after a program that we'd worked on that was working on health in these communities. And the idea was that is the client. He doesn't know who you are. You don't know who he is. You're driving by the road. But if you do your job correctly, his life is better and his family's lives are better. And if we work broadly in the way to say, what are we doing to really help uplift the quality of life in our community, then that's a guiding post. And then we have to apply principles, be straightforward, say the same thing as much as we can, say the same thing to different groups about the topic in the same way as much as we can, and then try to make sure that all can see how the entire enterprise benefits when they work cooperatively and collaboratively together. And that's a great challenge with so many egos. Real quickly, in the academic world, I was a tenured professor before. Getting tenure means you've done independent work that's of national importance. So you have to do something by yourself to get the tenure, and that's great. And once you do that, work years to do something by yourself, we then say we want you to cooperate with everybody else and be a group. So it's a strange thing. We select against that, and then we say that's what we want. And so a lot of our cat herding, or you've heard people saying it's herding cats. I lived in San Francisco for years. One of my favorite mentors referred to it as shoveling fog. You keep on doing it, but you don't have much left. So that's a lot of that, is to make sure we can give all this energy and have it work together. We're doing great. I love separate talk. I would tell you what a wonderful year we had, our best year in history as a university on many of our measures, our graduation rates and fundraising and research success and all. So it's really doing wonderfully well, and the big effort is to continue to help that to do better. And I'm fine. I have my lunch is cold, so I'm fine. Let me go to the back, and then I'll come to the front, and then I want to make sure I'll get back to work.
Diane Mueller, I'm the Chief Probation Officer for Juvenile Court here.
How are you?
Change in workplace is inevitable.
Yes.
So I just wondered if you can talk a little bit about how you manage people with change, because people don't like change.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
So part of that is great. So the question was, how do you manage change in the workplace? Because we like stability. And among things that are university values, universities value consistency and stability. I mentioned tenure. That's at the heart of it. You can go on forever. It's a real value among us. So change within systems like ours is, in fact, quite challenging. It pushes against the thing that makes us special. And so I mentioned my first job, and I had this responsibility. I was speaking in shorthand. So I went to medical school, did residency. I happened to go to medical school young and graduate a little young, so I was finishing residency, and I was 28. And I was going to do a postdoctoral fellowship. And I'm an ophthalmologist, as I mentioned, and in town there was a traffic accident, unfortunately, and a very prominent ophthalmologist lost his life. And so the person who was the chief of our clinic, who was a young person just hired to do that, went to manage that person's practice for him. They happened both to be Japanese, and that was the reason. So he went to manage the practice to kind of help out a little bit. And then actually he kind of liked the job, and then he informed the department that he was going to actually leave academic medicine and go and run this person's private practice. And that happened right about the time I was going to start my fellowship. And I had done a good job of residency. I knew the people and all, and so the department chair said, well, instead of doing your fellowship, why don't we'll just have you join the faculty now, and you'll be director of the eye clinic. And this would have been May or June when all this was starting in July. And I said, sure, what the heck? But I was 28. And so on Friday, I was a 28-year-old resident, younger than my resident colleagues by a couple years, and much younger than the faculty. On Monday, I was a member of the faculty, and now I was the chief of the clinic, and my professors were supposed to do what I said. And they had they couldn't have finished that whole sentence in their minds because it made so little sense to them. So I had no authority, I had no experience, I had no power, but I had to manage this group of 15 employees, these patients, the education programs in our clinic. And I knew, I guess, that since I couldn't do it, I couldn't make anybody do anything, I could only get things to happen if my idea was a better idea than what they were. I had to come with a good idea. It had to work better than what they were doing. It had to be easier for them than what they were doing. They had to be rewarded more if they did it my way than the way they were doing it. And that helped me a lot to think about, what can I say to my professor to make her change the way she's been doing things for 20 years into a system that I think will work better. And so it helped me think about what it is I wanted people to do before I asked them to do it, and what it was going to sound like to them. And that turned out to be good practice for me. So I think that we are in a system where good ideas can win the day. but they have to be good ideas. You have to think about them carefully. You have to communicate them well. Now, as you rise a bit, I had 15 employees, and great. You rise a bit on the ladder, you don't have the choice between good and bad, as I mentioned. It's like bad and worse, or not so good, and maybe not so good. And you do things that not everybody's going to like. And so you have to do things at times that people, then you have to use a little bit of force or whatever from time to time. But I tried always to minimize that and to try to get people to understand what was happening, why it was happening, and then if it's really a good thing to do, they ought to be able to see why they would like to support it and move along. So that's the hope, is that will happen most of the time. You tell me how much time I have. Yes. Okay.
Dr. Drake, thanks for being here today. I really appreciate being here. My name is Cornell Robertson. I'm a graduate of OSU from 1992. Thank you for leading the university that gave me my education. It served me well. Do you live in Franklin County?
I do.
I am your Franklin County engineer.
Fantastic.
My question for you is, I think, a pretty easy one, but I'd still like to hear your response.
Yeah.
And in your leadership style, do you ever, and how often, if you do, employ what I call the 24-hour rule, and that is to sleep on it, basically, before you come up with what your decision is?
The question was, in making decisions, particularly difficult decisions, do I ever sleep on them, ever put them into bake and marinate for a while before delivering them? Always. I mean, and you said 24 hours. I do it for weeks. I'm doing it today. I try to think about what it looks like and then put it down and then come back and look at it again. And sometimes it looks just great. Usually, you're not quite sure. And so I do it over and over and over again. And then when we make the decision, I know that I've given it full consideration. Some of them, the really difficult ones, you can look at backwards, forwards, upside down, sideways, and then you get to the point where you think it's okay, and just making the decision makes it look just awful. It's because you actually can see all the things you can't now undo that you didn't want to happen. All the things you want to happen, that's great, but you're really left with those things you didn't want to happen, and you have to deal with those. So I think it's always, there's always time to make a good decision. And rushing to things, I know you have to be, I spent time in the operating room, and you have to do things now often, so we understand that. You have to make decisions. But I think it's great to be able, particularly momentous decisions, to take enough time to make sure it looks okay to you tomorrow. I think that's when you have that luxury, I think it's a good thing to do. So great.
You spoke, my name is Joanne Lester with Franklin County Adult Probation. You spoke extensively earlier about the resume values and the eulogy values.
Yes.
Right? So oftentimes when people are pursuing those resume values with promotions, et cetera, yes, they have the conflict with those eulogy values.
Yes.
And my question is, what is your advice, or how do you handle, because the more hours you work, the less time you have for your family and to build for that. And, and oftentimes a lot of people end up compromising values and beliefs and become different people as they do that pursuit. What's your advice on handling that, or how do you?
Yes. So the question was, we have resume and eulogy values, and sometimes they come into conflict. And so what do you do about that? So, they shouldn't come in, you don't want them to come into conflict. So if they're coming into conflict, you're making a bad decision, I would tell you. So you have to, you want to live your eulogy values all the time. And you want your resume to be able to be built within the context of your eulogy values, and that's sort of the road to a really successful, happy life. Whenever you're doing something for your resume that doesn't support or live with your eulogy values, you're not doing so much life enhancing, for one, and you also run the risk of getting off on a bad tangent. When people doing what ought to be good things, all of your jobs are good things. All the jobs we have are privileged. If you're doing what ought to be a good thing and it's not working, or it doesn't work, it's almost always because you violated your own values to get there. Let me give you a real example. I mentioned my program in Boston a few years ago. Many years ago, 35 years ago, I was a postdoctoral fellow. I'm sorry. I started my job, my faculty job. I was given a break after a year and a little more, 2 years really, to go away then for half a year and do what I was going to have done in the research part of my career. So I got after things were established and calmed calmed down, I was given a bit of a mini sabbatical to go away and did a bit of a postdoc there. And I had been in the lab before I'd left home. So when I went to do that postdoc, that part, I went to Boston and had friends there I was working with. It was great. And I had a friend from medical school who was there, and he had a partner. This was a residency program at Harvard Medical School in ophthalmology, and they had 8 residents a year. And they paired them into 4 groups of 2. So each knew 1 pair, 2 pair, 3 pair, 4 pair. And they did their rotations together. So they do pediatrics and retina and whatever as a 2-person team through their 3 years. I had a good friend who was there who I'd known from when we were both in medical school in California. He'd gone east. And so I was very in touch with him. And his partner was a very successful, very outspoken, very sure of himself guy who'd been top of his class at Harvard College, top of his class at Harvard Medical School, and now was really the kind of henchman in this whole residency program, really a mover and shaker. And he went on then, and so I knew him and met him, and I kind of got it was nice for me to meet him because I met him a little bit senior and through my friend who was his partner, so his kind of larger-than-life personality wasn't an issue, and so we've known each other all these years. I don't know him well, but I knew him reasonably all these years. He went on quickly to become a department chair. Went then to become the chair of probably the most effective, or certainly one of the worst effective 1 or 2 eye departments in the country in Miami, and he was the chair of that, so a famous person in ophthalmology if you're chair of that department. He went then to be dean of the School of Medicine at University of Southern California, a very very powerful job in a very big place, and was really, really successful in fundraising and other things, and so a nationally prominent figure in ophthalmology, and then among deans, really. And this were a room full of deans. All the deans would know this particular person because of his outsized personality and his incredible resume. A month ago, he ended up in the newspaper. If you looked up USC Medical School Dean in the newspaper, you'd find that there were a series of front-page stories for at least 4 or 5 days front-page news, and then more after that, because he had a secret life of drug abuse and prostitution and other things that led to him losing his job and, again, having him on the front page of the newspaper. And so here was a person who had as successful and powerful a career as, you could get nationally prominent in what he was doing. Really big on the resume values. But his eulogy values, that part of his life, he'd really neglected and abused, and it turns into a horrible scandal and the whole bit. So, I mentioned it because it was news. I wouldn't want to talk about anyone like that, but that was a perfect example of exactly what not to do and how it's never worth it. So. Let's do one more if there is, then I'll make that I always do the one more.
I have one more. How many times throughout your day or your week do you have to incorporate your value-based decision-making there?
Yes. So values-based decision-making, let me say it differently. The values-based life, values-driven life. So the deal there is you use all of them all the time. All of them all the time. It's just what you do all the time. And I'll finish with something nice that someone said about me once. She said, this was part of the onboarding process here, and she said, gee, we were talking, and it came to me, she said this after all of it was done, kind of in whisper, that you didn't do the right thing because you thought it was the right thing to do. You do the right thing because you don't know any other way to be. And so she said that's how you were raised. You wouldn't know what it meant. It wouldn't make any sense to you. And so you want it to be that you can help guide yourself so that you're who you are in a consistent fashion, and that's okay with you in all the things you do. And then it works. Then it's easy because you can't figure out how to do it any other way, and then that's who you are. So let me say, in the things that are great privileges, it's great to have a chance to talk with you. It's great to talk about this subject. And actually it's a privilege for me to have a chance for a bit of reflection and to think about these things and to think about examples that make it true. And then hopefully it's good thinking for you. There are 2 things you can You can do, I mentioned John Kotter, K-O-T-T-E-R, and he has books on leadership that I found, and on organizational change and culture change, and all the short books, easy to read, big print, short chapters. Because he's a really effective teacher. So he'd have 8 principles that that you'd hear about in the first chapter, and then the next 8 chapters would be 1 chapter on each principle, and each chapter you can read in about a half an hour, 45 minutes, and then the last chapter is a summary of the 8 principles. So he really is good at those things. So John Kotter, and I appreciated his books and still read them. And then I mentioned that David Brooks, who's a columnist, and his talk on eulogy versus resume values is a 5-minute, 10-minute, something like that TED Talk on YouTube. So if you said resume versus eulogy in Google, then it will come up with this April 2015 TED Talk that he gives. And it's a great summary of ideas that he's pulled together from a lot of other people. So these weren't his originally. He really is a reporter and thinker. And so he pulled them together and put them into a TED Talk that's only a few minutes long. And I found it to be very interesting. Thank you very much for your attention today. Great to see everybody.